Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help.
Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about positive porn. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Paola Ferst. Paola uses she, her pronouns and is an outreach educator and community liaison at Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida. Paola provides medically accurate, age-appropriate, and inclusive sex education with compassion and non-judgment to youth, adults, parents, and social service providers. So Paola, thank you so much for being here today.
Good morning. Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you this morning.
Likewise. And I also have returning Jorge Valladares. Jorge uses he, him pronouns and is a professor of psychology at Valencia College, where he teaches general psychology, developmental psychology, and human sexuality. He has master's degrees in general psychology and clinical mental health counseling. Jorge was also a Rollins College Social Justice pre-practicum intern with the VSC in 2019. So Jorge, thank you as well for joining us again today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with both of you. As a really brief introduction, on this podcast, we discuss various social issues, some of which center around how they can contribute to a culture that may perpetuate and excuse sexual violence. So today, we are looking to explore how certain pornography can perpetuate rape culture, how we can talk to children about porn, certain cultural considerations we should take into account in regards to pornography, and what positive pornography is and looks like. So with that in mind, before we get into the meat of our conversation, as sex educators and as a professor of psychology for the human sexuality class that you teach, Jorge, in your respective positions, how do you talk about pornography? And either one of you can start off.
Sure. So as a sex educator, it's my role and responsibility to make space for important and difficult conversations. So whether I'm working with teens, I like to start my classes with, where do young people learn about sex and relationships? And while some might give the more obvious answers like peers or parents or movies or other places where they're getting this information, there's always that one student that shouts Pornhub across the room. And I always appreciate the honesty, which allows me to start the conversation. We're living in a time where young people turn to the internet for advice. And so it's really common for young people to be curious about their bodies, sex, and relationships. And in the absence of comprehensive sex education, young people are turning to the internet to answer these questions.
Thank you so much for all of that. I appreciate you talking about the honesty when it comes to education in general, because it's really important that we do look at our culture and look at sex honestly when we are educating about it. So that's really interesting that you bring that up. Jorge, how do you, if you do at all, talk about pornography in your human sexuality class?
Yeah, we do, and I have the good fortune that I get to spend 16 weeks each semester with a relatively small group of students. Classes are capped at about 25 students, and I feel like some of the dynamics of the class follow almost like you would in group therapy, like in a processing group. And by the time we reach our topic of, and it falls under the topic of sex for sale. By the time we get there, we would have examined topics like consent, gender, sexual orientation. That we would have defined sexual acts, sexual behaviors, the sexual response side. By the time we start talking about pornography, we already have a pretty well educated group and a group that already has a very high level of comfort with each other, which makes it really nice to begin talking about pornography. And so part of the approach, I kind of backload the lecture piece. I kind of sit back for a little bit and try to gather what the room knows about pornography and how they've experienced pornography and how they define pornography. I have a textbook definition that I could offer, but I'm always really interested in what students think about what classifies pornographic material. And I'm always pleasantly surprised about how much students know about pornography and how strong their opinions are about it. And then from a content piece to meet learning outcomes, we talk about the history of pornography, specifically in the United States, some of the legal implications, what the data says about pornography being harmful, what the data says about pornography being helpful, things like that. So that's how I've kind of approached it in the class.
Got it. And that actually leads to my other question, which is, I think pornography can be a rather complicated term, actually, to define, especially in the modern age. So could you provide your own definitions of porn? And it's okay if it's not too specific. I think it does depend. It can be complicated. So that's okay if it's not completely concrete, but from your own definitions of porn, and for the sake of this conversation, how are we defining porn for this discussion?
So I think starting off with acknowledging that today's porn is not the same as young people passing around an old Playboy magazine. So basically today, anyone with internet connection can instantly access anything you can imagine. And perhaps, a lot of stuff you probably don't want to imagine. But porn content can range from, lovemaking, posted by couples, to fetish videos, and even to eroticized violence and racism. So, there's this classic rule, number 34, that says if it exists, there's porn of it, no exceptions. So there's really all kinds of porn out there. Usually when I'm talking about it, especially since I work with a lot of young people, I'm mostly talking about sexually explicit video content that can be easily obtained through a Google search. So mostly things like Pornhub, which actually has more than 100 million viewers every day. And of course, we know a lot of young people are accessing other sexually explicit content through Instagram and YouTube and Snapchat and other online sources. And when I talk about sexually explicit messages, they're really everywhere. So sometimes they're in other movies, videos, and other places that young people are watching. And I do want to say that porn is not inherently harmful. While there are many harmful messages that are portrayed in porn, it's not all bad. And I do want to expand this conversation beyond the good versus bad binary. But yeah, so it's hard for me to really define it. But again, we can talk about positive porn. We could talk about responsible or ethical porn, but the reality is that's not the porn that young people are watching, or at least most people, from my experience. So that's kind of a starting point, but I'd love to hear your additions to that definition, Jorge.
Yeah, what's interesting too is that I'm 43, so I feel like I've seen the generation. I'm 43 and I grew up in a neighborhood with strip clubs and the porn store, where people actually had to go in to get pornographic material. It wasn't that you could just dial it up. You had to actually walk into somewhere to obtain pornographic material. And so, if I had to think of if with that image in my mind, I think about like a classic definition of pornography is like, visual, auditory, or print material that is developed with the intention of sexual arousal, and it can depict sex acts and nudity and things like that. So I think about that as a classic definition, but I think that you're absolutely right, Paola. I've seen terminology in the internet, like you've heard things like food porn, and you've heard of revenge porn, right? I think that term is being expanded, but I think it also it fosters really healthy dialogue about, well, really, where is that line? What is it, if my definition has any truth, then I can imagine stuff on network television that meets that definition, and so I think the lines are really blurry. I think there's a gradient there. So I think a lot of stuff can be included in the term pornography. So I think it's starting to defy definition almost.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. And I think when we have these conversations, it's okay for things to be in a gray area. I think a lot of times we try to put them in boxes, and we are trying to do that a little bit in regards to just kind of defining it for the sake of this conversation. But I do welcome the idea that it is kind of a gray area sometimes, and that's okay. That being said, Paola, you mentioned kind of the different like positive porn, and you talked about porn that could maybe be harmful. So I wanted to kind of throw a question out there of how would you define positive porn?
Sure. So I do want to reiterate that, positive porn definitely exists. However, that's not what the majority of young people are watching. So it is important to keep in mind that porn is adult entertainment, and most young people are watching free content available, like I said earlier, through sites like Pornhub. But there is responsible porn. Others might call it ethical porn that has higher standards and guidelines. So, for example, positive porn or ethical porn doesn't include anyone underage, ideally anyone under the age of 21. Porn actors are paid fair wages. They often model safer sex practices like condom use and communication and boundary setting. There's absolutely no coercion, and consent is essential. So that's really not always displayed in mainstream porn. So that's the biggest difference. And responsible porn also displays an inclusive representation of different bodies, disabilities, and racial and gender and sexual identities. So it's more inclusive and it's more real. So I think that's the biggest difference. And, it's hard for a lot of people to really understand what's real and what's not when it comes to porn. And so ethical porn is a little more realistic, or if they are playing out a fetish or a fantasy, it's done in a way that's responsible, where there's good communication and boundary setting. But again, I know we're talking about positive porn, but because I do work with a lot of young people, I just want to stress that most young people aren't paying for porn, and so they're not getting this quality porn that does display healthier sex practices.
Yeah, and those are, as you were mentioning that, it sounded to me almost like food. If I want access to good quality food, that's going to cost me a little bit more, or I'm going to have to seek it out. And I think a certain level of access, I think I have to be at a certain level to be able to access that healthy material when it comes to pornography as well. And that makes it like other systems in our culture.
Definitely. And you talked a little bit about it, about how we can kind of distinguish the two. But I wanted to delve in a little bit deeper of, what is, if we have that positive porn on one side of the spectrum, and I like to look at things as a spectrum, right? You mentioned like the binariness of it, but I think that we can look at it on a spectrum. So what do you think is on the other side of the spectrum? What is that harmful pornography that could be out there that could be perpetuating that violence, non-consensual, those kinds of things? What is that other side of the spectrum?
There was one thing that Paola mentioned that really kind of struck me was, paying fair wages, which I thought was important, paying fair wages to actors. And I think that in a lot of the if I can call it mainstream pornography that we see, like Black male actors, for example, they have difficulty with wages as well. They have there's like almost this microsystem of oppression for them as well in the pornography industry. And what we see from a lot of mainstream pornography is this perpetuation of the stereotype of the brute. Very often when there are, like, there's this term that's used in pornography, interracial porn, right? And it's a little bit deceiving. It's actually a shorthand for black guy, white woman, and most often those scenes will depict some sort of violence, right? It'll either be, if it's web porn, it'll very often be titled with an aggressive title, and the content will often be aggressive content as well. And I feel like in that way that could be an example of how porn could be harmful in terms of social perspectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can play into stereotypes, racism, like Paolo was mentioning earlier too. It makes a lot of sense. And then perpetuating the idea that Black men are violent too. And then the victim always being the white woman. It does kind of paint a picture that perpetuates certain ideas that just simply aren't the case always, right? In terms of sexual violence. Paolo, do you have anything you'd like to add about that?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to add, just really adding to what Jorge just said, mainstream porn often lacks inclusive and diverse representation and, sometimes perpetuates harmful gender stereotypes and misogyny. So, like, for example, a lot of heterosexual porn is shot from the male's point of view, where sex is portrayed as something men do to women rather than with women. So it sends this message that women exist primarily as providers of male orgasm, which can sometimes promote this message that sex is about the outcome versus the experience.
Sure.
So I always think about young people who maybe don't know what sex is, maybe they've never experienced sex, and they're learning about sex through porn. And so this is just the messaging that they get. And so that's something that I think about a lot. So yeah, porn is so nuanced, and I like that you said it's a spectrum because there's so much content out there.
Yeah.
But the violence and the misogyny is, I think, on that far end of the spectrum that can be a little problematic, especially if someone's not watching it with a critical lens and they don't understand that this isn't real. That's where it can be even more problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds like how we can kind of distinguish the two is having that critical lens and making sure, is what I'm watching ethical, like you were mentioning, responsible in the sense, are the actors being treated fairly and being paid fairly? Is this perpetuating greater social issues or not? Is this consensual? Those are really important things to consider when we look at porn. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can teach that to the people in our lives, including children. But I wanted to ask you, Paola, in your trainings, you discuss that the average age when a child actually first comes across pornography is actually 11, which is a lot earlier than I think a lot of people expect. But the more that we're having this conversation, I'm not surprised at the same time, just because of how easy it is to find it. And it could be by accident too. So how can adults listening talk to the children in their lives about pornography?
Sure. So yeah, that always surprises a lot of people, especially parents. So it gets them thinking about how they can start those conversations. So really, regardless of how many obstacles parents try to put in place, children and teens can access porn anonymously, like right on their phones. The first involuntary sightings usually happen around age 9 or 10, and sometimes even earlier. I will tell you, I've had students come up to me after class and say, I was 6 the first time I saw porn and it was scary. I had no idea what to do. So it happens. but we know that intentional searches start between 6th and 8th grade on average. So, it's common for a young person to hear a word or a concept and search those words on Google because they're curious. And that's common, right? So maybe they hear boobies or a naked woman. So they search, and the images that come up are often more alarming than arousing because of the sexually explicit content that's so readily available on the internet. So it's important that children have a parent or a trusted adult they can talk to if they see any disturbing content online. So, when people are exposed to porn or any kind of sexually explicit content at an early age, they might think this is what sex is, and they might feel pressure to look or perform like the people they see in pornography once they become sexually active. So, again, it could be very jarring, it could be startling, or it can be used as an educational tool. So there are so many different ways that parents can start the conversation with young people in their lives. And I do want to acknowledge that for some parents, it can be awkward, and that's normal, and that's totally valid. But some tips are really helpful. So amaze.org, I'll give a quick plug, is a wonderful website, and they actually recently developed a lot of tools for parents. But one conversation starter that I really like that some parents use, and they say that it's helpful, is saying something as simple as, I was just hearing on the news about how kids are trying to do research for a school project and they keep finding porn online because they put .com instead of .org. And you could say something like, has that ever happened to anyone you know? Because I would guess it would be pretty surprising. And they might have seen, way more than they would have wanted, right? So it's a way for, a parent to engage and start the conversation. So maybe the young person won't be so open about saying, yes, that happened to me, but they might say, oh yeah, that happened to one of my friends. And then that's just a way to start the conversation. And just a few other key messages to keep in mind. I don't know, Jorge, did you want to add anything to that, while I'm kind of going on about tips, because that's kind of my wheelhouse, and I love giving advice on parents on how to start these conversations, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, and then I have a few other tips that I'd like to add.
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying. You were talking about how a parent initiates conversation, and you may have more tips about receiving, but I like that advice about initiating the discussion. Getting in front of it rather than waiting until you discover, one day you look at the browser history and, here you have all these visits to like a porn site. So I love that suggestion of taking a curious approach to finding out if the child has had any exposure, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, I love that too, because I talk a lot about kind of having like that safe space, or some people like to describe it as brave space, so that you have the vulnerability factor of talking about certain things that are maybe emotionally charged or have, unfortunately, like shame behind them and stuff like that. So I appreciate the idea of kind of creating that safe space for that open dialogue, for a conversation that naturally can feel awkward. And I think whenever I talk about trainings and in my trainings about how we can talk to our children about sexual abuse and those kinds of things, what's really important is just having that communication and letting the child know, like, you can talk to me about this. And I think the way that you open that conversation, it seems like it would be really easy to foster that kind of relationship in that sense, which is really important.
I was going to say, I love that you said brave space. I've never used that before. And I think a lot of times in our field, we use the word safe, but not everyone feels safe all the time.
Right.
And so really just inspiring courage, I think, goes a long way. And so, with that being said, one of the biggest tips is, having young people talk to a trusted adult, and sometimes they don't even know what that even means, right? So cultivating those skills too. But I just wanted to add a few key messages that are super important when parents or caregivers are having these conversations with the young people in their lives, is really knowing that porn is common. So we need to name it. It's common, it's out there, it exists, people are watching it. Being curious about porn is normal. So really normalizing it, and also, really letting them know that the images in porn are unrealistic, because when a child's brain isn't fully developed, they can't tell what's real and what's not, what's real, what's fantasy. And so, and again, if you see something, I am here, you can come talk to me, going back to early exposure, if a child sees something at 6 or at age 8, they might not know what they just saw, but what they just saw maybe was scary or traumatizing in a way. And if they don't have that trusted adult that they can come to really unpack and process that experience, they need that brave space. So I love that. I'm going to use that from now on. That's such a cool way of flipping the narrative a little bit. So that's just some tips that I would give to parents if you're listening, is really start the conversations and start as early as possible.
When you say start as early as possible, what age would you recommend actually?
That's a really good question. I think anytime a child has a phone and they're using Google searches and YouTube, it could be, hey, if you see something scary and weird, you can talk to mommy. If that's 3, if that's 4, whenever that is, they're not going to know it's sex. They're not going to know it's porn, right? And again, it's those unintentional, searches that might come up. But if someone's giving a child a phone, I would advise you to give them the tools to help navigate. And if they can't, then at least a place where they can come to if they see something that's scary or alarming.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense. Jorge, what were you going to say? Sorry about that.
I was just going to say that as a parent, our reaction to, there may be that situation where we don't have the opportunity to initiate the discussion when the conversation is kind of thrust upon us, and maybe don't expect it so much. And I think that our reaction to that is pretty important. I think that's going to determine whether or not it becomes a safe or a brave space. And maybe this is good in other areas as well, is finding a way to manage our reactions a little bit. It can be a very emotional experience to have a young person say, hey, or even show us an image. Hey, look what I found. I think even if parents are listening and you haven't gotten to the point where you're ready to initiate a discussion, at least think about how you might receive that message or how you might manage your reactions when a young person does present questions that you might not be exactly ready to handle. It's interesting because my first experience with pornography was finding a set of Playboy under someone's mattress, and the reaction was punishment. It was harsh punishment. And so that whole event, that whole experience was very confusing, very, very hard to understand. And I remembered it as like this, I must have done something really, really, really wrong. And not only was it confusing, but it also made me very, very much more curious about what was in those magazines than I had been originally.
That makes a lot of sense. And thanks for sharing that story. I have a feeling that a lot of people have had a similar experience when it comes to that. Paola, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I love, Jorge, that you said, parents to try to manage their reaction. I think it's responding versus reacting, which is very hard as parents. Sometimes when a child does something that could be disappointing or frustrating, it's like the initial thing to do is to react, right? But, really stepping back, because if a child comes to you because they are brave enough to share something that they saw, you want to hold space for that and just, ask questions and be supportive in a way that's going to inspire them to keep coming back as they develop and as they continue to maybe see or experience things that might be difficult. You want to be that person that they talk to. So I love that you said that. And yeah, of course, thanks for sharing your experience, because it's all relevant today, even though it looks different. It's that same I was going to say, the shame, I think, that comes up, it's like you're now punished because you're curious about your sexuality instead of, well, why? Like, why are you interested in looking at this? And let's talk about this. And let's look at this magazine together. Do you think this is real? Like, how do we teach, porn literacy? How do we, open up the conversation to where it's not dirty, shameful, and wrong, right? So thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome. And I would say also that as my kids started to ask questions about these things when they were younger, I had to fight the impulse to react in the way that my parents reacted to me.
I mean, it makes sense, right? We talk a lot about, culture in general in mind trainings too. And we didn't create the idea that there's shame around pornography. It's been perpetuated through generations and generations. And so it's totally normal to feel that impulse when we look at pornography and associating it with a shameful background to it. So it's really hard to break those down. But we're all doing our best, I think. And talking about it and having this space, I think, is really helping it too. That being said, I wanted to also ask, is there a way we can encourage youth to be more analytical or critical? I know you mentioned like porn literacy. I think that's a great term to bring up about pornography. They come across and search for more porn that is more ethical and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't promote porn to young people. I understand that young people might find porn and search for porn. And so, sometimes teens are less interested in watching porn and really more curious about what it's about because they hear about it. Maybe their friends are watching it. So, I did mention it's really important to teach porn literacy and have open conversations around porn to help young people understand what they're watching with a critical lens. So, helping them understand that porn is fiction, it's not real. Most people don't have bodies that perform like porn stars. A lot of the popular behaviors they might see in porn, like facial ejaculation or sex without conversation or consent, don't necessarily reflect what most people like or want in sex. So many teens are surprised when I explain that there's usually a director and actors and, they're playing a character. They're like, no, miss, that's not true. Like they cannot even believe it. And that just goes to show that developmentally, they can't really decipher what's real and what's not. And so, again, I don't promote or discourage it. I think, as an educator, I create a space where we can have, open and meaningful dialogue around these things so that if a young person decides to watch porn and they find it and they explore on their own, they can really look at it with a critical lens and say, okay, maybe this turns me on. I like this, but I know this isn't real. My penis doesn't have to be this big. Maybe just because I see something doesn't mean that my partner will be interested in this too. So really having conversations around how to teach them to be critical and say, okay, well, how do we have conversations and talk about sex before we have sex? Or, a lot of those things. And so, so I think that's really what it boils down to is, like Jorge, like you were saying, you find a magazine, you're curious, someone tells you it's shameful, dirty, and wrong. Well, now you want to keep looking through that magazine instead of saying, hey, it's normal to be curious. You might want to find something online and you might find something that you really like and might turn you on. But let's talk about, what's real and what's not. And helping them really make sense of that is the most important thing when we're teaching porn literacy.
I think there's so many great points in what you said. I mean, I love the term that you used. Hey, I think maybe my body doesn't function the way that I'm seeing in some of these films, or the body image, and my body doesn't look like what I'm seeing in these films. I think that's important as well. Not only in children, but I think in adults and with couples also, and how I think there's a whole other dynamic too with how adults use pornography and how couples might use pornography and what impact it has. And then how couples might have open dialogue about sexual preferences, right? And so if I grew up and my model for what a healthy sexual behavior is mainstream pornography, it might be helpful for me to have some dialogue with my partner to get a sense for what their ideas about healthy sexual behavior are. I think there's this really excellent tool that you may have heard of, the want, will, won't list. I think is a nice way to begin that kind of conversation, so that if I have some ideas about what I'm interested in sexually, things that I'm willing to do sexually and things that I just won't do sexually, they can come out in the open with my partner. And I think that would be a nice way to maybe deconstruct the lessons that some of us learn from mainstream pornography.
I love that. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, it sounds like what I'm hearing over and over is just communication, honestly, and being honest about it and knowing our boundaries and teaching children about boundaries and that kind of thing. But being open about the conversation seems to be really the biggest thing that we can take from this. So I appreciate both of your points. Thanks so much. Going off of that, what role does social support play in this conversation? For example, between parents and children, caregivers and dependents, close family, and romantic partners, like you were mentioning, Jorge. One example that comes to mind is a person perhaps with a disability for whom pornography provides maybe a healthy sexual fulfillment. So if the person relies on caregivers, what role do the immediate support network play in the person's rights to sexual pleasure, rights to sexual privacy, etc., via pornography?
Yeah, so I wanted to add that, sexual feelings occur for individuals with or without disabilities, and masturbation and sexual exploration are a normal part of sexual development. So it's common for young people to want space to explore their bodies, and some might choose porn or other ways to enhance their experiences. So all teens, even those who may depend on a caregiver, need privacy or space to explore their sexuality. So while some parents and a lot of parents really might want to control whether their child watches porn or has sex, it's better to give them tools and information so they can have safe practices without shame or judgment, and they can navigate their own sexuality. So, of course, parents and caregivers want to teach regulation and appropriate touch. Like, for example, it's okay to touch yourself in private, or it's not okay to touch yourself here. And of course, if someone has a disability, sometimes it's hard to regulate those things. But giving them space and privacy is really important because all people deserve to experience their sexuality. And of course, if a caregiver or a parent has concerns about their child's behavior, sexual development, they can always consult with a medical or mental health provider if they feel like, they need some help. Like, is this normal? Is this not? Because that's really what a lot of parents are asking sometimes. But really giving all people the safe space to explore. Like I have friends that have teens and they're like, I know my teen watches porn. So I talk about it with them and I say like, hey, it's not real. That's not the way people make love. Or let me insert my personal values and beliefs here as a parent, right? You have the right to do that. But everyone really has the right to have privacy, regardless if they have a disability or not, so that they can just be in touch with their body and explore their sensuality and sexuality in that way. So that would be my thought there. I don't know, Jorge, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I love those. I love the comments that you made. I think that's right on. Making it okay to explore and giving space to explore. That can be more difficult in some situations than in others. I think about young people that grow up in a house or an apartment where there isn't the opportunity for privacy. And so, I think about that a lot. I think about people from cultures or who live in environments where actually a young person is not entitled to any privacy, not from a sexual standpoint, just culturally, that's what it means to be of a certain age. So I worry about situations like that. I think you also made a great point that if there are concerns, if it reaches a point where, is my child, okay, I get that my child is masturbating. I get that my child is using pornography, but are they using it too much? Are they masturbating too much? I think that if there are some real concerns about that, I think you're absolutely right. Seeking out a medical professional or a mental health professional is a really good way to go.
Jorge, I really appreciate you naming that privacy is a privilege, because that's so true. I said it and I didn't even think about it. And I'm like, I grew up in a very small house and I shared a room with two sisters. I didn't have any privacy. So here I am going, every teen, every child deserves privacy. And culturally, you're right, it's not always the norm, right? So, again, for parents or caregivers that are listening, especially at Planned Parenthood, we always teach that parents are the primary sexuality educator for their children and teens, and you have the right to really share your values and beliefs when you are having these conversations. But we're just giving, some advice on how to, make it kind of a safe, safe wouldn't be the word that I'm looking for, but just how to really cultivate and allow them to explore their sexuality. But it's hard sometimes to navigate these conversations. So I really want to name and acknowledge that. It's very nuanced. There's not a one size fits all model. But, I just hoping that everyone can feel good in their body and, have a space to explore it with some sense of privacy, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And having that openness, and I think in every family, there are boundaries, right? And that's very healthy to have. So within those boundaries, having those private spaces, I think, and having the open conversation at the same time is really, really needed. I also wanted to talk a little bit about rape culture. We haven't really talked about it too much in, naming the actual term in this podcast. And I'm sure we'll eventually have an episode just on rape culture. But in my trainings, I do bring it up, which it is a culture that perpetuates and normalizes sexual violence. So within this conversation, I think we can agree that, and we talked a little bit about it, that some pornography can be violence. However, with safe words and consent involved, is there a way that porn that features violence can be more ethical or positive without perpetuating rape culture?
I think I mentioned to you once, I invite Darcy and Master Cecil from the Woodshed, and they own a BDSM club in Orlando, and they also do a lot of education in the community about BDSM and BDSM culture. And they come to my class and actually do a lecture on consent, but that I always really love and appreciate. And they talk a lot about how mainstream pornography and the way that BDSM is depicted in mainstream pornography, how harmful that can be to the BDSM community at times. And they do a really nice job of offering detailing really some of the things that aren't common practice in the BDSM community that are often depicted in some of these porn films. So I think that's just a nice example, how sometimes that it can be harmful. Yeah. How times pornography can be harmful from a social standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we bring up, Paola, you talked a lot about, pornography isn't real. So that's always important to bring up too. And I think that's such a good point about the BDSM community, that pornography can perpetuate certain things and it can be harmful for their community as well. And actually, we do have a podcast that we're going to be coming up that is about BDSM, and we'll explore more about it. But essentially, from my understanding, there is a very clear definition of consent, and they're very clear about consent within the community itself. So I do believe that if there is consent, blatantly involved, there's safe words, and there's other parts of the that we talked about before, about the ethicalness of it, the ethics of it, I should say, of the responsibility of the paid fairly and obvious consent, and no one's underage, those kinds of things. I think that people can explore those particular fetishes in a safe way, sure, that without perpetuating rape culture. I do think that it can be very complicated and murky waters at the same time, and I want to acknowledge that too. But I do think that there's a way that could come about, because I think also it would be counterintuitive to shame people for what they're interested in too, right? At the same time, which can be complicated. Paola, was there anything that you wanted to add to this question?
Sure. Yeah, I love that you said that, because at Planned Parenthood, we always say, don't yuck someone's yum. So, with that in mind, there's, different sounds or visuals or fetishes that might turn someone on and bring pleasure. And for someone else, that can put the brakes on. So, we keep talking about communication and consent, which are so important. But, really being able to have a conversation and say to someone, I'm absolutely not comfortable with this, or I'm okay with this. So, at Planned Parenthood, we use this acronym FRIES, which stands for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. So, bringing this acronym into the context of porn, there's no pressure, force, or manipulation. So if someone's watching porn with a partner or even on their own, they're doing it because they want to. No one's forcing them or pressuring them into do it. Acknowledging that it can be reversed. So someone can change their mind if they're no longer comfortable with the idea of watching porn, or if they want to stop at any point. Of course, it should be informed. So they should have all the facts and information. Enthusiasm comes a long way. So, if someone does agree to watch porn, it's because they're excited, they're curious, they're interested. It comes from their own desire, not someone else's. And of course, there could be a shared experience where, someone shares like a fetish or a desire, and that can maybe turn their partner on. But again, there's no pressure. And it's very specific. So someone might say, like, I'm okay with spanking, but not with choking, right? Or I'm okay with porn, but I can't watch anything that has any minors or any young people or whatever it is. So being very clear, and that does require a lot of communication. And, Emilie, you mentioned safe words. So they're also an important boundary for sexual play. And, a lot of times when people are thinking about, having sex or having a sexual experience, the first thing that comes to mind isn't, let me set boundaries in the bedroom or wherever people are having sex, right? But this does give a clear way for a person to communicate with their partner or partners what they are uncomfortable with whenever like an image or a trigger comes up. So a safe word, and it could be anything, you get to decide what that word is for you, is a verbal stop that is easily delivered and understood. And the good thing about a safe word is it doesn't require extra communication or context. So it's a way to just know that, hey, this isn't working out for me, let's stop. So that's something that can really help people have, a shared, safe, and pleasurable experience.
Absolutely. And you brought up a good term, triggered, and I wanted to kind of delve a little deeper into that too, specifically from the perspective of a sexual assault survivor. So as a survivor, watching porn could be overwhelming or even triggering. So do you have any suggestions for a sexual assault survivor who wants to explore their sexuality through porn without feeling overwhelmed?
Just stemming from a conversation that you and I previously had, a previous podcast that we did, my mind immediately goes to somatic quieting. Like, how do they, they may be having an autonomic response, in response to the images on the screen. I think that part of going into this, I think it could be helpful to develop some techniques around somatic quieting in preparation for or during the experience, to try to maybe quiet that fight, flight, freeze response, maybe reach a calm state where they can access, their feelings of pleasure and arousal.
I love that idea, and I think that you kind of reminded me that there's different types of porn. I think we're talking a lot about like the Pornhub videos in my mind, that's kind of where I'm going. But I would also invite survivors to maybe start with maybe just images or just sound. And then I love that idea of kind of having a safety plan almost of like, if I'm feeling overwhelmed, who can I turn to? What can I do to kind of calm my self? So I love that idea of, it's always important to remind everyone listening that if you're in a crisis, you can call the Victim Service Center. We have that 24-hour helpline, 407-500-HEAL, HEAL. So if you are feeling overwhelmed at any point, you can always reach out. There is a crisis counselor on the other line, and there's always other avenues to get support during a crisis, or if you're feeling overwhelmed during that too. So I love that idea of, explore there, maybe start somewhere not as overwhelming for whatever that means to you, and then from there, having like maybe a safety plan of, if I'm feeling this way, this is what I can turn to. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add, Paola, before moving on to the next topic.
Well, I was going to add really a lot of things that you and Jorge just mentioned. So, my advice is everyone's experience with sexual trauma and trauma triggers are unique and different. So while porn might help some trauma survivors gain a sense of control over what happened to them, for others, it might bring flashbacks or remind them of that negative traumatic experience. So, again, taking control back of your body and experience can be empowering for some survivors. It can also help them change the outcome or ending of a traumatic experience that has happened to them. But if someone is using porn during partnered sex, having a safe word can help, again, as we talked about earlier. And whether someone's using porn alone or with a partner or partners, it is important, like you said, Emilie, I would really just emphasize creating a safety plan and just knowing how you can respond if something does come up. And then just take it slow, bring awareness to the sensations and feelings that might arise, and just know when to stop, if anything's too triggering or just doesn't feel right and good. And sometimes it can be hard for survivors to get back into that body experience. And so, just taking it slow and just know that everyone's healing journey is different and you're not alone. And so, creating a support system or working with a therapist in the healing process can really help.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All really great points. Kind of shifting gears a little bit here. What are some cultural considerations and considerations of access that should be made in determining whether pornography can be a positive aspect of one's sexual life?
I think a lot about my upbringing. I had a very parallel experience with my sister. We grew up in the same house. We're similar in age. We were close, had similar experiences. And now that we're a lot older and we talk about our past, I realize that we experienced it a lot different. And so if I think about when I was a kid and me and my young friends were got access to a bunch of porn movies, though the messages in those films really did a lot to bolster our confidence, but they didn't say a lot of good things about the girls that were around us. It almost gave us permission and instructions to do things that weren't necessarily beneficial to them. So I think about also where this is being consumed and what is the social environment around the person that is watching pornography. What about those ingredients, or the very opposite? So. I get caught with a couple Playboys and I get spanked a little bit, but for another child, getting caught with porn in your browser history could really be harmful. It could get you kicked out of your home. It could get you beat severely. It could, so there's some other things that I think about as well, like how the cultural environment will react to discovering that the child has been accessing porn, or how, my family will react as an older adult, and as a parent. How will, here I am talking about, the benefits that porn might have in a person's sex life, but really, how will my family treat that? How will they react to learning about this stuff? So I worry about some of those things as well. I think that having a cell phone and having a stable internet connection is a privilege. I think it facilitates access. I think that when you live in communities that are hypersexualized in pornographic film, I think that could be dangerous, you know. So those are just some random things I think that come to me when I think about pornography and culture.
Yeah, I think when we're having this conversation, it's important to recognize and acknowledge that the individual experience, that not everyone is coming from the same culture, not everyone has the same family dynamics, and it's important that we recognize and acknowledge that as we go through this conversation about pornography. So I really appreciate you both kind of bringing that up. In regards to, that, I wanted to also ask about, what are some developmental considerations that should be made in evaluating whether pornography can be a positive aspect of one's sexual life?
I love the fact that Paola brought up an important aspect of childhood, and that is distinguishing what's real and what isn't, what's imaginary and what isn't. I think that's an important consideration. What stage of development am I in? If you think about adolescents have, now they can tell the difference between what's real and what's not, but then there's this imaginary audience that adolescents tend to have, and this feeling of invincibility that they often tend to have. And I think it's important, as Paola was mentioning, is talking about how mainstream pornography is different than the way it is in life, in real relationships. So I think those two are important considerations.
Absolutely. Anything that you want to add, Paola?
Well, just acknowledging again that, porn is adult entertainment. And if we name that, then they understand, well, this isn't for me. And again, I guess we're all on the same page. Porn is not real. An adult brain understands that. But really just acknowledging again the reality that, young people will see or watch porn at some point, whether it's out of curiosity or, to help enhance their experience with solo sex or partnered sex, but just having these open conversations to help them navigate any content they might come across. And you did ask earlier, and I don't know if we were able to answer, but maybe some of the signs that someone has an unhealthy relationship with porn. So something to think about, and this can go for anyone, for young people and for adults, is that if it's getting in the way with your activities or your relationship with others. So for example, if someone can't stop watching and it's getting in the way of their schoolwork or their relationship or other commitments, that can be, something to think about. If they become more demanding or aggressive with a partner or partners, or they're not satisfied in their partner, that's something to also think about. And, if someone feels like they're watching so much porn that they now start to lose interest in sex, or they might even lose money if they're paying for porn, they're spending a lot of money on it. So these are some signs to look out for. So ideally, if someone's using porn, it should be to enhance sex and relationships rather than inhibit those experiences. So that's something to keep in mind. I've had a lot of parents at different times in my career tell me, I have a middle school student or I have a middle school child, and they're, watching porn so much, I can't get them to stop. They're just like on the computer all the time, and I'm really concerned. So, those are some things to look out for. Everyone's experience is a little different, but I just wanted to name that. So, yeah.
I think that's so fascinating. Those are great points, Paola. I feel like I'm learning so much from you. It's funny because some of those signs are so akin to what we find in like substance users who are addicted to their substances, things like uncontrolled use, right? Changes in mood, impairment in major life activities, things like that. And so that it's so great that you kind of pointed that out.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And, it's very controversial, believe it or not. Some experts do not believe that porn addiction is real. Others say it's, more of a compulsive behavior. But regardless, we don't even have to judge it or label it. If anyone's listening and they're like, I'm not sure if this is okay, like I feel like I'm watching too much porn, it's taking over. Like you said, with any behavior, whether it's food, sex, substance abuse, whatever it is, shopping, right? If it becomes compulsive and it's taking over, that's when you might want to talk to someone. or really maybe scale back. And if you can't stop on your own, then, seek help. Talk to a trusted adult, talk to a therapist or someone else to help you kind of, navigate your sexuality in a way that feels like it's supportive rather than, problematic.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that it should be something that enhances instead of inhibits our relationship, our intimate relationships too. So I really appreciate all of those, and yeah, like with everything, in moderation. And I love all the points that you both brought up. I wanted to also ask, by promoting the use of pornography by individuals in general, do we risk supporting a media that promotes harmful stereotypes? For example, we talked a little bit about the black brute stereotype is alive and well in pornography, and it strongly influences the careers and opportunities of black men in pornography. So by promoting pornography by individuals, do we risk supporting that aspect as well?
I think a lot about, I don't even know if I'm going to term this appropriately, but I think about like pornographic images in mainstream media, period, and how that can be even more easily accessed. I mean, the way that, in like if you think about women in magazine ads, for example, in the history of women in magazine ads, those images to some degree have been pornographic. So I think about some of that as well. And I've lost sight of the question, but those are thoughts that just came to mind is, do we see some of these images in really just our mainstream media?
I love that you mentioned that, Jorge, because I think it really goes back to, teaching media literacy, and I think there's so much, there's a lot of harmful stereotypes that exist, not just in porn, but in magazines and movies and TV shows and other places where people don't even realize that's where they're getting their messaging around sex and relationships. I'm not here to promote or discourage porn, but I do want to acknowledge the harmful stereotypes that are often depicted in porn, like what you mentioned, Emilie, the black brute stereotype that feeds into this idea that black men are animalistic and violent, which perpetrates racism and frankly, hypersexualizes black bodies. And so, if people are watching this and they're, believing in these stereotypes,
sure.
It could be a way of feeding into it instead of critically thinking like this isn't real. So, I know, to tell someone you have to be a critical consumer, that doesn't sound very sexy. Yeah. And I get that. And, if people are consuming this content, you have to think like, why? Like, let's unpack, kind of the messaging behind it. And I think a lot of people are just consuming without thinking. And whether they realize it or not, it's really influencing the way they think, feel, and behave, which can be, problematic if, what they're consuming does feed into these, racist and otherwise harmful stereotypes.
I love that. And it kind of brings me back to, Jorge, you talked about food in the beginning, and it's almost like we need to consume in a responsible way with pornography as well. And I think that is absolutely possible. And that way we can start to break down these things that contribute to our society that prop up things like racial stereotypes and prop up things like rape culture. And so I think if we take it from more of an analytical sense and recognize that there is porn out there that doesn't do those things, and that you can consume it and still have it enhance your life like you were mentioning, I think that that's kind of what this conversation is all about. And going off of that, how can someone explore their fantasies in a healthy way through pornography?
Yeah, I think, it's normal to have fantasies. And just because someone has one doesn't mean they have to act upon them. And that's for both adults and teens alike. But porn can really help people become comfortable with a fantasy they or their partner might have. It can help someone, it can give someone ideas or help them get in touch with what turns them on. So that's, something that people can do. Now, if people, like I mentioned earlier, consuming porn, and they understand that what they see is a portrayal of their fantasy, great. But if they have these unrealistic or harmful expectations for themselves or their partners, that's when what they're watching could become an issue. So I think about it as more exploratory versus exploitative. So it's being able to really explore, like, how is this, again, enhancing my sexual experience? How is this a tool to help me get in touch with my body and my partner's bodies? So it's using it as a way to explore. But if it's then creating a space where people are confused and they're now having these unrealistic ideas of what pleasure means to them, or putting pressure on a partner to perform or do something in a certain way, that's when it could be unhealthy. And again, it's a spectrum. I hate using the healthy versus unhealthy, but it's using it in a respectful way that feels right and good for that person or the people that are using it as a tool to share their sexual experience. I don't know, Jorge, do you want to add anything to that?
I love that I love that, that idea as a basis for fantasizing and getting ideas, but not using it as standard setting, as a way to perform. And it could be a basis for good conversation, more than a model for how sex should go. I think couples can do a lot of really, really great things. And I think, getting some ideas from, or getting sources of fantasies from things like, positive pornography could be useful. But again, recognizing that, what we see in porn films, is not something that should be replicated in real life, or something that should, establish within us an expectation for what sex should be like. So I think it could be a good thing for couples to use if they have other techniques in place, other mechanisms in place, to help them talk about the way that they have sex.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads to my final question for both of you here, which is really kind of like the big money question, which is, how do we help people identify pornography that is positive for them? And I think that highlighting the individuality of that, just like self-care is individual as well. So how can we, help people identify that, and who should help people do this?
So, as we've talked about, there's a lot of sexually explicit content online. And, again, as rule number 34 says, if it exists, there's porn of it. So there's really a little something for everyone. So, I would suggest that people know their limits and find content where their identities are represented and respected. So being able to maybe find porn that has actors that look like them, that maybe share their gender identity or their sexual expression, or even racial or cultural identity could be important. So while porn can maybe help someone learn about what they like, it might also be helpful for someone to know what they're looking for. And of course, that's very personal, like you said, Emilie. So if they know what they're looking for, then they can search for that. But of course, they might search and explore and find new images that hit their off buttons, and explore new content that might accelerate the arousal response. So I'd really encourage people to look for ethical porn that is transparent and consensual, if possible. And, again, teaching porn literacy and creating critical porn consumers is super important, so that all people can understand, what is real versus fantasy, and really enjoy those fantasies, if that's the goal for them. Through porn, they can explore and find out what content, if any at all, can help support their sexuality. So I'm not going to say, go to this site or look for this porn director. I'm not here to promote anyone in particular, but I'm here to say that there's something for everyone. And it might take some time if someone's like, hey, I really want to explore my sexuality and use porn as a tool to help facilitate that, then great. Just know your limits, know your triggers, know when it's too much. And you might have to sift through a lot of really bad content. And again, bad for me might not be bad for you. Everyone's different. So That's what I would say, is just take it slow, explore, have fun, and set those limits for yourself and in your relationship. Create the safe word, set boundaries, explore consent and communication, and know that it's an exploration. So that's what I would say. It could be fun. And, again, going back to kind of the cultural conversation we were having earlier, for some people, porn can be completely off limits and taboo. It's up to you as an individual to really identify your own values and beliefs, and really do what fits within your framework.
Yeah, what I think is great about that response is your emphasis on the individual rather than a specific type of porn or a porn director or a porn brand or whatever the case is. It's about self-awareness and self-knowledge, an awareness of my sexual rights, my sexual identity. I think those pieces are important, kind of as you mentioned, what are the things that I'm interested in, and recognizing that others might have different preferences, different interests. So I think you're absolutely right. I think a self-awareness would be an important first step. What am I interested in? And also, what are my sexual rights? My right to privacy, my right to sexual pleasure, my right to freely associate with others in a sexual way, my right to safety. So I think all those things are really important before identifying what pornography is right for me.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate both of your responses. It was such a pleasure to have this amazing conversation with both of you today. Before I sign off, is there anything else that either you, Jorge, or Paola want to address to the audience about pornography or anything that we discussed today?
I want to thank Paola. I feel like I learned so much from you. You really are a wealth of information. And I think you even helped me to refine my perspective on this a little bit. I love some of the recommendations that you make for parents. So, if you need to listen to this again, parents, if you're listening and you need to listen to this again to get some advice or some steps to follow, please do, because I think a lot of really great stuff came out today in talking to children, preempting a conversation, setting up a stage for a good conversation, and then maybe responding to questions that children might have when they have already accessed pornographic material. So thanks, Paola. That was really great.
Yeah, Paola, I want to thank you as well. And I want to thank you, Jorge, too, for bringing in your perspective and taking the time to talk with me today. And I also want to thank, the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much again, Jorge and Paola, for being here today and having this conversation with me.
Thanks for having us, Emilie.
Thank you so much for having us. Really enjoyed the talk.